Okay, welcome to Energy Bites. I'm your host, Carl Rosenberg, and today I'm joined by Mari and Shana. Great to have you all here.
Hello, hello.
Happy to be here.
Brilliant. In this episode, we'll take a closer look at support schemes, a topic recently discussed on Energisnack by ELS Elena Kinsey and Lina Håkansdotter. Their discussion centered on the underlying logic of today's regulatory design, that public support is primarily directed at the supply side, sort of stabilizing the production capacity, while the demand is steered through mandates, quotas, cost exposure. In other words, policymakers provide the carrot to producers and apply the stick to the demand side, with the expectation that market actors will sort of align incentives and meet in the middle. So the key question is whether this system is sort of delivering efficient enough outcomes. So I'm sort of throwing it out to you guys. Should we maintain this supply-driven support structure? Or is there a case for revising the regulatory framework? And if so, what would a more coherent design look like? I'll throw it over to you, Mari.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between what type of energy source we're looking at here. I think a lot of the discussions in Energistock was about these immature technologies, green fuels, green hydrogen, this sort of technologies that today have alternatives that are fossil fuels but are cheaper. So creating a sort of production of, say, for instance, e-fuels today doesn't really make sense when you have a fossil fuel alternative that is a lot cheaper. So you need to have some sort of incentive to create a market for it. But I think it's very important to actually have a strategy for that, because if you want to create a market for it, if that's the main aim, then it's very important to sort of align that with the demand as well, because we see, even if we are targeting supply today, we are seeing supply demand imbalances. I mean, if we look at, for instance, green hydrogen in Europe, we have a target, European target, I think it's 10 million by 2030 of green hydrogen. We are way below that today. I think the 24 numbers was around 0.02 million tons. But still we have project cancellations due to lack of offtake. So there is, on the one hand side, we have not enough supply. On the other hand side, it's not materializing because of lack of demand. So I think in many of these industries, I think there's an imbalance there.
So you're essentially saying that there is a coordination gap. Projects exist on paper, policy ambition is high, market ambition could also be high, but the final investment decision is either delayed or the project is scrapped. Do you think that one should sort of abandon the supply side support, or do you think one should sort of complement that with more demand side anchoring?
I think it's important if we want to create these markets, which I think a lot of people agree on that we are trying to do and that we should try to achieve. I think it's important to have this sort of coordination. And I think the main issue is at the start when we don't have enough supply so that everyone has to comply. And we see that in, for instance, and Shana, you know a lot more about this than I do, but in the regulation for maritime, for instance, it has a clause that if there's not enough RFMBOs by 2030, the sector does not have to fulfill the target. I mean, that creates a very difficult market for producers to operate in. And I think if even and seeing that the price of those RFMBOs are going to be a lot higher than other alternatives, I think coordinating that and not leaving consumers waiting to see if everyone complies before they do themselves, I think that's important step to take to coordinate this.
Yeah, is there some sort of coordination at the EU front, Shana, or how are things looking there?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Mari said, actually, and I think that the policy uncertainty is a huge topic here, and perhaps this lack of coordination that you're signaling, Carl. But I just wanted to say first that I think that this last episode with Lina and Elin was super interesting, especially for this topic that we're discussing, because it's not an easy topic, and I think that many things need to be considered when you're talking about support and resharing mechanisms. And trying to answering your question again, it's a very complicated topic, but I think that supply support only is not enough. As Mari was saying, it's a problem that has two faces, and we cannot see it as the solution to all our problems. I think also that the real issue here is bankability, and we have discussed this many times within the team at the office. And I think that there are many uncertainties, as I was saying at the beginning, and as Mari was signaling, there are a lot of uncertainties for new projects. We have revenue uncertainty, we have policy uncertainty, and we also have offtake uncertainty. So you have a price risk problem that's not only a high capex that can be solved with only a direct grant to initially fund the project, but also at the policy level, you have a risk that concerns the credibility of the demand framework that Mari was also talking about, as in the maritime regulation, for example. So yes, we have targets in place, but will compliance be softened under political pressure, or if prices rise too much? This risk is there. And lastly, of course, some targets are also on the demand side, but not too many, since normally we have more incentives on the demand side and more targets on the supply side. So of course you have the risk there on like who will be buying your product, really. So basically we don't often match support to the real problem, because this sometimes it's electricity price risk, sometimes it's offtake, sometimes it's infrastructure, sometimes it's permitting. So I'm usually a supporter of having a holistic approach to regulation, but targeted solutions are needed, especially in this case.
Yeah, Lina Lelin raised an important point about the sequencing, namely that support schemes should follow strategy, not precede it. Before instruments are designed, there needs to be a clearly defined objective. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to evaluate whether public support is actually needed or in the end has actually delivered the intended outcome. And I sort of would argue that these articulated strategies and targets also serve another function. They create transparency and legitimacy from a taxpayer perspective. Do you think that this is something that needs to be sort of further strengthened from the EU and its member state sides, or what can be done here in order to enhance the sort of market situation?
No, but I completely agree. I think it's a very good point, especially in these, because I think the absolute worst case scenario would be the state putting a lot of money into these new technologies. Say for instance e-fuels, which we know, and I think that's an important thing to think about when we talk about these industries. We don't really see them as becoming cost competitive with their alternatives anytime soon. I mean, it's not sort of pushing a lot of money into these technologies and that we expect them to cost the same as fossils in 10 years or 15 years. I mean, obviously it's difficult to see exactly the low level it can go down to, but that's not an expectation. And then I think the absolute worst case scenario is using a lot of public funding, putting it into a lot of different projects, which either do not really increase in volume or do not become a sort of market in and of itself, and creating this sort of worst, spending a lot of money and not getting a real outcome out of it, a market out of it, or climate gains, which is essentially the whole point, right? And I think creating very firm strategies is a good way in one case of doing that nationally. I mean, we see, I think the UK has gone out a lot regarding, CCS, green hydrogen. They have very clear targets in volume. And I think on the one hand, it does sort of set the market very firmly. Like, it's not creating maybe that much leeway for different projects, but I think for these technologies that are expensive and are so immature, I think that might be necessary in order for them to come online. at all, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I sort of want to throw something to you, Shauna. Like, what can be done, or is the EU doing anything about sort of the volatility here, with regards to policy? I mean, one example that happened the other week is that EU allowances contracts dropped nearly, I think it was €6 in a single morning after Merz sort of questioned the current design of EU ETS. And at the same time, CBAM is also under question here. And it sort of suggests to something that you mentioned earlier, that, the uncertainty about the longevity of EU climate and energy policy, rather than the design itself, is the main factor sort of undermining the market confidence. It's not really about where the stick or the carrot actually lie. It's the uncertainty on whether the policy is going to be implemented in the first place.
Yes, of course. And actually, what you're saying about the CBAM uncertainty problem that we have right now, it's interesting because many member states were asking for these temporary exemptions, but then the industry went out and said, hey, no, we need certainty here to be able to make investments and keep on with the targets and work towards that. So even like the industry is going out there and saying that because credibility in policy is really needed. If companies think that the rules might change in a few years, they're not going to invest in anything. So I don't feel, or I don't think that it's really a problem about supply versus demand, where to support, but it's also about confidence. And I think it should be a matter of combining both things, essentially. So on the one hand, the policy needs to be saying, yes, we will help stabilize the cost, and yes, we will make sure that there is demand, so nobody carries the risk on their own. But these two need to remain unchanged and kept, despite the challenges that we have in the current geopolitical situation.
Do you want to comment on this, Maria, as well?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point. I was just thinking, because I had this conversation a few days ago about whether we think there will be any ESAF in Europe produced in 2030. And with the sort of, we have the revision here in 2027, and I was thinking about like who would go into an FID for an ESAF project this year when there's a revision to the regulation next year. There's been a lot of talk from airlines that they want to change it because there's not enough supply, it's going to be too expensive, a lot of uncertainty. And what sort of market climate does that create for these producers? According to EU, we're supposed to have supply of ESAF from 2030 onwards. And we still haven't seen an FID in Europe. So I think it's very true what you say, Carl, in that, and Chana as well, that there's a lot of policy uncertainty, which is not creating a stable investment market. But I also think that these years that we are coming to now, where this legislation is actually starting to being introduced, and we'll see how compliance works and how flexibility is, I think this year and the next two will play a very, very big role in the outcomes in 2030.
But if we go back to sort of the original question that I posed, the value chains and the support schemes that are actually in place, are they targeting the right constraint, or are they merely, increasing supply into a system that sort of lacks the structural conditions to absorb it?
I think it really also here depends on the sector. I mean, even if we haven't really seen this, but in the aviation sector, for instance, there is very clear targets of demand. And I think it's very different, say, in the maritime sector, where we have seen projects being cancelled, like Ørstan, the e-methanol project being cancelled due to lack of offtake. And there's all these different consumers saying, but there's not any supply. So I do think there is this very lack of willingness to pay. And I think there is definitely something that's not matching the supply with demand, mainly because supply is very, very expensive.
What do you think, Shauna?
Yeah, well, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, I don't think that we're really targeting the right constraint, because sometimes we don't really know what we're trying to solve. We might see that there isn't enough supply, so we fund production, right? But perhaps there is no supply, but there is no buyer either, or no infrastructure, or no grid connection. So yes, you can have many funding schemes to support a hydrogen plant, for example, but if there is no hydrogen pipeline yet, or no buyer willing to sign a longer term contract, the problem wasn't really production, it was the whole system around it. And yes, of course, one has to start somewhere on this never-ending circle or chicken and egg thing. But perhaps we need a rethinking of how this support system is designed, essentially.
What is the EU here looking at? Is it looking at a combination of supply side support along with carbon contracts for difference, for example? Is that something that the EU is steering towards?
It depends on which sector we're talking, right? I feel like we're moving more towards targeted support, for example, with the upcoming, or at least announced, SAF and SMF auctions expected at the end of this year by the Commission. But I feel it like it's a mix of both. But again, it depends on the sector that you're looking at. And we could be here for many, many hours, Carl, if we talk about all of this.
With regards to ESAF, then, is that something one is looking at there, sort of combining support for electricity production along with sort of industrial offtake in order to sort of boost the incentive for long-term contracts?
Not really, actually. On the demand side, you have many incentives, not only in the Refuel EU regulation, but also the EU ETS tool, of course. You have these two incentivizing airlines to use SAF, but you don't really have a support scheme there. And that's going to come at the end of this year, hopefully. And on the production side, you do have many funding mechanisms to support the production of electricity, but they're not really targeting that this is going to end up in an ESAF product, really.
Yeah, to sort of wrap this discussion up a bit, I think one can summarize it as, the core issue may no longer just being, supply slash demand in isolation, but sort of getting that system coordination, that support schemes needs to focus less on maybe maximizing capacity and more on sort of ensuring that supply, demand, infrastructure, power pricing evolve together. And in order to sort of get this coordinated structure, one needs a strategy, as Elin and Lina sort of discussed together. But I see that we are sort of nearing that 20-minute mark, so I'm going to throw out the question: what are you guys going to keep an eye out for?
Well, I see that the deadline for the third hydrogen bank auction is expiring in 3 days. I think, like wrapping up the discussion we had today, I think it will be very interesting to see the outcome of that. We have now had a less optimistic second round, with projects being cancelled despite actually having initial offtake agreements. So I think it will be very interesting to see how that turns out.
What about you, Shana? What are you going to keep an eye out for?
Well, I think our audience knows about this, but in December, the Early Movers Coalition with 8 member states was launched. Unfortunately, Sweden is not part of this coalition, but this coalition is now working on to have a joint auction for ESAF at the beginning of this year. And as I said, if this goes well, the Commission would create something similar at the EU level for aviation and maritime fuels, both bio and hydrogen based in theory. So this will be very interesting to see, although I have the feeling that it will take a bit longer than expected, as always. But it will be interesting to see how this first pilot auction goes, and then how the Commission tries to translate this into an EU level thing.
Since we last spoke, there's been a big development on the nuclear side. Vattenfall has formally submitted its plan for new nuclear investment. The government's response to this is the very interesting part. It has been a rather muted celebration, one can call it. The spin from the government is that they are expecting a multitude of applications beyond the one that they just received. So this development is quite noteworthy, suggests that Vattenfall's proposal may not be to the government's immediate liking. Hence, this is something that is worth keeping an eye on, and we at ELS has been talking about this for quite some time now, that the big risk is the financing, and that is the real sticking point. And I think this is all from us. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.